Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network GRUM. I'm Hovik Manucharyan, and together with Asbed Bedrossian, we're talking with our guest today about the foreign policy prospects of Armenia in the aftermath of the Second War in Artsakh. This episode was recorded on Friday, June 4, 2021. On November 9, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia signed, quote-unquote, the statement, stopping the war in Karabakh. Since then, the harsh terms of the agreement have catapulted Armenia and Artsakh into an ongoing political crisis. However, amid focus on Armenian domestic political developments, the larger regional context is often absent or misunderstood or overlooked.
To help us delve deeper into the broader regional context of recent developments in Armenia and Artsakh, we are joined by Dr. Pietro Shakarian, who is a Cleveland-based historian of Russia and the Soviet Union, with a focus on Soviet Armenia and the Caucasus during the era of Nikita Khrushchev's Thaw. Hello and welcome, Pietro.
Hello, and thank you for having me on, Asbed, Hovik. Good to talk to you again as well, too.
Last time when you were on our podcast, Pietro, you mentioned the idea of a new Cold War. This is an important idea because I think the entire post-Soviet era has been a new Cold War, since the West essentially failed to bring Russia into its fold and expand what we call the West. How do you define your notion of the new Cold War?
Well, Asbed, I think that when we talk about this notion of the new Cold War, it's distinct from the old Cold War, which is to say the 40-year Cold War, which began at the end of World War II and more or less ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. This was kind of a major kind of competition between the United States and Soviet Union. It had ideological components and so on and so forth. There was, as you know, the competition for the Third World. But this new Cold War is much closer to Russia's borders. This is a new Cold War that really, as you kind of alluded, it really stems from the failure of the West's policy toward Russia in the 1990s. And we're going to touch on that a little bit tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of the NATO expansion issue, but really kind of that is one of the key moments, one of the key aspects of it, the expansion of NATO, the NATO military alliance, all the way up to Russia's borders. This idea of the American policy of expanding its influence into not only the former Warsaw Pact countries, but also the countries of the former Soviet Union itself, which is to say countries that were really part of Russia, part of the Soviet Union.
The former Soviet Union.
Yeah, the former Soviet Union. So that's actually a major difference between a country like Poland and a country like Armenia, a country like Ukraine, Georgia, Kazakhstan. So this is much closer to home for the Russians. And especially when we talk about Ukraine and Belarus, these are countries that the Russians really see as almost like extensions of themselves. I mean, these are East Slavic peoples, countries, civilizations. There's a lot of intermarriage. Once a scholar asked me, actually it was the late scholar Stephen F. Cohen in New York, asked me, what are the numbers on the intermarriages between Ukrainians and Russians? And I said, I don't know. It's got to be in the millions. I mean, you look at people like Mikhail Gorbachev. He was part Russian, part Ukrainian. His wife was fully Ukrainian. You look at Solzhenitsyn, who was part Ukrainian. Nikita Khrushchev was, born in Ukraine. His wife was Ukrainian. So, I mean, there's just so much mixture of peoples. Yuri Shevchuk of the Russian rock band DDT is of Ukrainian origin. So many, prominent figures in Russian culture, politics, literature. Gogol, let's say, they have some roots with Ukraine. So this history is really kind of mixed. Same with Belarus. So when we're talking about the West making encroachments into Belarus and Ukraine, that's a very, very serious thing for the Russians. That's like almost like as if Russia were to expand into, I don't know, Massachusetts or I don't know, Ohio. I mean, it's like that.
How about Canada?
Or Canada. Oh, yeah.
So what do you think is the impact of NATO all along the perimeter of Russia or the former Soviet Union, but perhaps more specifically on the Caucasus region?
Well, I think when we look at NATO, the problem with NATO goes all the way back to this period of the late 80s, early 90s. It actually looked like the West and Russia were reaching a moment of rapprochement. You had Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the great reformer of the Soviet Union, meeting up with Ronald Reagan. And you have, that was actually kind of the interesting element of this pairing. You had a very conservative president and you had American president, and you had this kind of liberal, open-minded Soviet leader. But they both found a kind of a common cause in denuclearizing really the Cold War, and to really kind of cut down on the arms buildup, and to really kind of actually cut back on arms. And so it kind of goes back to this period of high trust. Ronald Reagan had that phrase, trust but verify, right?
Well, was it an altruistic effort, or did it work to somebody's advantage at the expense of the other?
Well, I would say this, Asbed, that actually when we look at that period, the altruism, that the Soviet leaders really took the Americans at their word. They really thought these are our friends, our druzhya. We trust them. They came to they came to see the Americans not only as negotiating partners but as friends, and that trust was broken really in the 1990s with the Boris Yeltsin presidency. But the NATO expansion, to go on this issue of the trust, Mikhail Gorbachev was actually promised verbally, not once but 3 times, by former Secretary of State James Baker, that NATO would not expand 1 inch past the former East Germany if the Soviet Union agreed to German reunification. And Mikhail Gorbachev took Mr. Baker at his promise. This is all, by the way, documented in the National Security Archives. So this is a fact. This actually happened. And they took this as being, the Americans are going to keep their word. When the Soviet Union dissolved, and you had the Russian Federation, you had these new states, after a few years, under the presidency of Bill Clinton, which is kind of interesting, this is a Democratic president, he suddenly begins to initiate this effort that NATO can suddenly expand and bring into the fold the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that had been part of the Warsaw Pact, the former Soviet satellites, such as Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland.
I mean, I can imagine that this is one of the reasons why NATO makes Russia so angry. Was the change of course planned, or was there a gap in understanding between presidents, or did relationships drop, or what happened?
I think that there was a change in perception over time. I think that, well, the issue kind of goes back to George H.W. Bush. During his campaign for the presidency, he actually, so this is George Bush Sr., actually invoked this idea that we won the Cold War. And that idea was then taken up by President Clinton, that in fact, instead of this being Cold War that ended by the mutual consent of both sides, which if you look at President Reagan's diaries, it says in there that President Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, and me, we both together ended the Cold War. So the Soviet leader ended the Cold War with the American leader together. But the narrative became in the 1990s that no, we defeated the Russians. The Americans were the ones that, through their greatness and their strength, defeated the Soviet Union single-handedly. That we kind of, by our, Star Wars and these military buildup, that they could not compete, and so they broke up, and all this kind of thing. That we defeated them. And that kind of, triumphalism, that became the American policy toward Russia in the 1990s. It informed the advice that Yeltsin was given to privatize the economy with shock therapy means. That suddenly, now that, socialism is discredited, we should have like hyper-capitalism in Russia. And that was kind of what you saw, the robber baron capitalism.
And the Yeltsin years, Yeah,
and the Yeltsin was barely sober during those years, as we know. But also the issue of the NATO expansion. And this is really when it took off in actually more like the mid-90s, where NATO expanded all the way up to Russia's borders, including eventually the Baltic states. So now NATO was all of a sudden on the doorstep of St. Petersburg. I mean, think about that. I mean, so NATO is in Estonia. That's right next door to St. Petersburg. And in NATO, some advocates of NATO would say, well, look, those countries, they wanted NATO there. Like Poland, they wanted NATO to protect them against Russia, a resurgent Russia or whatnot. But the problem with this argument is NATO is not, it's not the association of retired people. I mean, this is not like, a fraternity or a sorority. You can't just like walk in and join. This is a security alliance. If your membership does not enhance that security, of the security of the other members, then it's highly questionable. And that we have such discussions about Turkey as well, too. I mean, is Turkey really enhancing the security of Germany and France and the UK? I mean, no, I don't believe so.
I think that's an interesting point that you raise, because Georgia and Ukraine, as you know, have stated that membership in NATO is a national strategic goal for them, right? And something like that, like you said, you can't just walk into NATO and say, I'd like to be a member. It takes years and billions in planning and equalizing their military defense systems, the industrial complexes, and things like that. What do you think would happen if the Armenian government decided to pursue NATO membership?
I think that would be a catastrophic mistake on the part of the Armenian government to join the NATO military alliance because they look to Russia primarily as their main security guarantor vis-a-vis Turkey and Azerbaijan. And if Armenia were to withdraw from any kind of Russian sphere in that region, automatically Ankara would fill in the void. Mm-hmm. And this is actually what many people don't understand. When they look at the Caucasus region, they think, well, if Russia, it can be between Russia and the West, right? So if Russia is gone, then the West can kind of fill in the void. What they don't understand is that, in effect, Turkey would actually be filling the void.
Well, there's no other way, right? Because if the West wants to come into Armenia, they have to come through Turkey. Everything else is basically blocked.
And the same goes for Georgia, too. Georgia would more or less de facto be under Turkish influence.
Right.
And that's something, again, people aren't seeing. It's a very serious danger for these countries. But I think that the NATO, no, I don't think it would be a smart move at all on the part of the Armenian government to pursue this. And actually, there have been rumblings. I have, some very highly placed sources in Yerevan who tell me that there are members of the Pashinyan government who have flirted with this idea of Armenia pursuing NATO, which I think is absolutely foolhardy.
Instead of looking at it as in a binary way, a lot of people have argued that Armenia should reevaluate its security posture, especially its reliance on CSTO, which didn't seem that valuable so far, and forge other partnerships that are not like strategic level partnerships, or they're not military alliances, but can somehow help balance Russia. What would you say about that?
Hovik, there is something to be said about that. These countries in the former Soviet space, while the partnerships with Russia are very important, ideally, they should have the best of both worlds. They should have access to both Russia and the West. That's point number one I want to make. Now, in terms of specific defense issues, that's up to those countries themselves. I mean, this is where you kind of go back to the ideology of kind of the iron ladle.
Yeah.
Right? So to some extent, Armenians have to be, if they're going to be defending themselves, they have to be, first and foremost, preparing for their own defense vis-a-vis Turkey and Azerbaijan. And they have to be coordinating with CSTO allies on that defense. They have to make it known to those countries that, we expect you to help us. And there has to be kind of a very specific and clear, strategic vision that they're communicating. First of all, they have to show that they can defend themselves. And second of all, they have to kind of create a solid partnership with these countries, with Russia, let's say. They have to build trust with Moscow. And part of the problem with Nikol Pashinyan is he has not, first of all, been an effective military leader. From what I understand, he has not been able to effectively build a very good strategic alliance with Russia. So that's that. I think that part of it goes back to this idea of Armenian self-reliance. Armenians have to be prepared for any eventuality. That's actually something going forward in general Armenian leaders should be thinking about. They have to be considering what if there's a scenario in the future where Russia isn't in the region?
Yeah.
Right? We have such examples in the past where Russia fell into civil war, right? In the period of 1917 to 1923. Yeah. And Armenia had to defend itself. I mean, in this period of time. And of course there were people in the Armenian leadership at the time during the First Republic who were saying, actually, the government of the Armenian First Republic who said, the West will help us, the Allies will help us, the Entente will come in and save the day. And there is still this hope, actually, among some Armenians that the West will come in and save the day. But in that part of the world, no.
And also,
they have to be more realistic.
For people who say that the CSTO was not useful during and after the second war in Artsakh last year, let me also say that during the war, at the time of our darkest needs and everything, France was there with words. They wanted to help militarily and everything, but they can't project into the Caucasus, right? America, France, England, these countries cannot project into the Caucasus except maybe through Turkey. Now, if our problem is with Turkey, do you think Turkey is going to allow help to come to Armenia through them?
Exactly.
No, and the other problem also on top of that, I just want to add, is that Turkey, if we're talking about France and Turkey, I mean, if France and Turkey are in an antagonistic relationship, it's going to be very difficult for France to move resources to Armenia without, and bypass Turkey in order to somehow confront, Turkey.
Yeah.
The problem is how do you do that? How do you haul that material support over to Armenia? It's a logistical thing. I mean, first of all, they're not in the region, France. I mean, they're far away. And the other thing also about CSTO is we also have this evidence that CSTO actually offered to help Armenia, that they warned the Armenian leadership actually that this attack was coming from Azerbaijan and Turkey, and the Armenian leadership apparently didn't get the memo.
Well, I mean, in any case, I mean, the bare facts are that the biggest member of CSTO is giving us most of their arms, so that speaks for itself. But what's interesting to me is that unlike 100 years ago, this is no longer like if there is a war, we'll be fighting with Turkey. We're actually, even during this war, there were allegations that Turkey made use of NATO satellites and all the NATO infrastructure to help gain military advantage and help Azerbaijan. And we're not just talking about the West actually helping, whether we can sort of divorce Turkey from the West and maybe get help from France. If there is a war again, resources that France contributed to NATO, the satellites in space and resources the US, can actually be used against us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Which many people don't.
I think absolutely you're 100% spot on, and not only that, it's also the fact that the tactics used by the Azerbaijani army. I mean, these were NATO tactics that they were lauded for during the course of the war. And when we look at this issue of NATO versus Russia, this is another thing as well too. That if let's say Turkey were to launch a direct attack on Armenia, I mean, this could spark like a nuclear war. So actually, Turkey was getting very close to playing. I mean, they were effectively playing with fire in Karabakh. They were pushing very, very close to something that could lead to a direct confrontation with Russia. And that's, another element of this as well. This is this big kind of geopolitical element.
So what role does the EU's Eastern Partnership Program play in this context?
Well, I think that if we're looking at this effort to kind of expand, American influence in the post-Soviet space, I think that there was kind of a reaction to that policy after the 2008 war with Georgia, right? That France and Germany made their position known that they would not accept Ukraine and Georgia in NATO because, it does not, enhance the security of that alliance. So what you suddenly had was this, the emergence of this new organization known as the Eastern Partnership, and Sikorski of Poland, who was the foreign minister, he was pushing for this idea of bringing the post-Soviet countries in the Western fold through the back door via the EU membership incentive, what they call the Eastern Partnership Program. And he paired up actually with Carl Bildt of Sweden, who was kind of like an add-on, right? Poland more or less was spearheading this project. This was the organization that actually sponsors those association agreements. A few years ago, we remember that Serge Sargsyan, the Armenian president, was forced to choose, between the EU agreement versus, CU, the customs union, the Eurasian Union. Yeah, and the same thing, of course, we saw with Ukraine, and the reaction to that was the Maidan in Ukraine, which led to the overthrow of that government there. So the Eastern Partnership really kind of plays this kind of position as kind of the back door to NATO. That's an important point that people have to look at, that this is an organization that is trying to kind of bring these countries in through the back door. And also, by the way, I don't think it suits American foreign policy at all. It doesn't enhance American security, to do this. And also, let's dispense with the myth that Russia somehow wants to pry Turkey away from NATO. Because the Russian, if you look at Shoigu, he's a smart guy. If you look at the Russian general staff, I mean, you look at people like Gerasimov, they're smart guys. They're not dummies. Turkey benefits. Anybody who observes what Turkey does knows that Ankara benefits from, at one point, acting independent, but using NATO as a cover to do whatever it wants.
That's right.
Using NATO as a cover to ethnically cleanse northern Cyprus. Using NATO as a cover to wipe out Kurds, bomb Kurds in northern Iraq, or wipe out Afrin.
So you think that the S-400 issue was more of a ploy on the part of Turkey rather than Russia?
I think that it was probably more. I think that it's something that even if Russia is selling these weapons, they probably understand that at some point NATO already has the knowledge of these weapons, and so it's not something that they're just gaining money from Turkey.
Yeah.
They're just getting, the Russian arms industry is getting money from Turkey, but I don't
I admit that I did think that Russia was basically trying to divide the NATO countries.
I think that they want to encourage Turkey to, I think that they were hoping to encourage Turkey to pursue more of an independent path. But Turkey benefits way too much from using NATO as a cover to get away with what it does. If you're in the Russian General Staff, you know that. They benefit too much from that arrangement where they can act like a tough independent guy in the neighborhood. So it's almost like, the kid down the street in Cleveland. He's like a tough guy, on the street corner. And he's not going to want to give up his position as the top bully of the street. And that's kind of how Erdogan feels. He feels like he's the top bully of the Middle East. He doesn't want to give that up. But at the same time, he also uses the NATO security alliance as a kind of a cover to get away with all his, misdeeds.
Yep.
So I think that when we look at that, I can't see the Russians would logically really believe that they could pull Turkey away from NATO. Maybe they could believe that they would encourage an independent streak in Turkish policy vis-a-vis the West. But I don't think that there was ever realistically this idea that they could actually pry Turkey away from NATO. Because that's actually something, I think, Turkey, by rights, it should be out of NATO. It's violated the spirit of NATO so many times. It should be out of it, but I think it benefits Turkey too much.
It does. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Armenia has been trying to rebuild the country, its form of government, its society, in the image of the admired democratic West. As a result, like many independent post-Soviet republics, for example, Georgia, Ukraine, and Belarus, our society is full of these democracy-building, non-governmental organizations, commonly known as NGOs or civil society organizations. Now, all the republics I just mentioned went through the so-called color revolutions in the past 15 years. In the case of Georgia, Ukraine, and Armenia, they succeeded in bringing Western-oriented or Western-friendly regimes to power. These NGOs and people, who either led these NGOs or were members of these NGOs, sort of transparently transitioned into the government as a result of many of these revolutions. As much as what happens in Armenia, if you see a lot of the administration is permeated with people who formerly part of civil society. So our society is rife with conspiracy theories about the goals and agendas of these organizations, as well as the colorful regimes that came to power. For example, I think people don't like this term, but they call them Soros types or Sorosakans in Armenian. And I know that civil society organizations view this term as very, very much in a derogatory manner. For example, as an anecdote, I just saw a Freedom House report today where they were investigating who started spreading the word Sorosakan. And they started talking about going back in time, tracing it back to 2018. And this was a report about disinformation in Armenia. And this report had zero mention of the word, of all these like fake news YouTube channels that are going around. Anyway, I digress. So, Pietro, I wanted to ask you, does democracy building in countries like Armenia and Ukraine and Belarus and Georgia help or hurt U.S. national security or anyone else's security?
Well, I don't think, I think first of all we have to define what is democracy building, right? So first of all we have to ask, why does the United States feel compelled to build democracy in a country like Armenia or Ukraine or Georgia or Belarus? These are sophisticated societies. You guys know that. I mean, you've been to Armenia many times. And Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, Russia. These are societies that are, the people here are sophisticated. They are capable of building democracy on their own, right? The Soviet Union went through periods of liberalization. We have the Khrushchev Thaw. We have Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika. So, they're capable of doing this on their own. Why do they need Westerners to come in and teach them how to do democracy? Like as if they're little children who need to be taught. I can't imagine anything more demeaning than that. So when we look at this idea of democracy building, is it really democracy building? It's more like influence building on the part of the American war hawks, because not everybody in the United States in policy circles necessarily agrees with this philosophy or this approach.
It's a remnant of the Western colonial mentality, right?
Absolutely, I would say that it is a colonial mentality that these countries cannot
govern
that these
themselves
people
or-
cannot think for themselves. They cannot govern themselves. They need somebody to hold their hand. I think that it's absolutely demeaning, and it creates a lot of resentment, and actually creates a reaction. It creates a reaction even against democracy, which I think is very unsettling.
And unfortunately, it also creates a bad reaction, I think, against civil society in general, because there are some healthy segments of civil society that should be welcome. But because of this stigma for being foreign funded, I think it does a disservice to everyone, because then they're automatically grouped, with.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and also I think that it does not help. It doesn't even help American national security. So we talked about these organizations that might be funded by George Soros, but that's only a small part of the picture. Right? What about National Endowment for Democracy? What about the International Republican Institute, the International Democratic Institute? This is a whole effort led by, American foreign policy hawks who want to expand American foreign policy into the post-Soviet space. And also, really, it's motivated by this ideology that they, see that the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, and they don't want to see it ever reconstituted in any form. That they want to keep Russia on its back.
And you look at the results, right? Ukraine is a war zone. Georgia is a war zone. Can we agree that actually the sort of, I guess, projection of Western soft power, if you may call that, has actually helped destabilize these countries, especially when it's done artificially. Can you discuss what the West's thinking towards these countries is going to be now from this day on? Is it going to be more of the same, or are they going to evolve a little bit?
I think that the United States has a lot of domestic issues, and I think that they should focus more on the domestic issues. I mean, there's this whole idea, the philosophy of George McGovern, come home America, and there are people in the United States saying that. Douglas McGregor, and you have, Tulsi Gabbard, these individuals talking that we need to focus more on our domestic issues, and we can't get caught up with democracy building. I mean, you saw also not only in the post-Soviet space, but look at how democracy building worked out in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. I mean, all these countries, it has not been, a success by any means. This is actually what Serge Sargsyan, the former Armenian president, was talking about when he talked about more powerful forces. He wasn't talking about Soros. He was talking about, the American military-industrial complex, the very one that President Eisenhower warned against in his farewell address.
So, what was the context of that quote that you mentioned?
Well, that was in his recent interview, actually, because they were asking him about Soros, I believe.
I think he was saying, he was saying, I was not afraid, or I did not lose to Nikol Pashinyan. I lost to much more powerful forces.
Well, and he was right about
north.
that, actually, and he was referring. Yeah, and specifically, I would say he's referring to this kind of Western military-industrial complex. I mean, this is part of this geopolitical thing, this geopolitical context. That's what he's really talking about.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think this issue may be a factor in the upcoming elections in Armenia. For instance, even.
But wait. One thing, really quick, Hovik. Yeah. I want to just pause because I didn't get a chance to really directly answer your original question, which was, what's the West's policy toward these countries moving forward? Like I said, I would prefer that the United States, let's say, focuses on its own issues, because this does not even enhance American national security. Can we agree on that? I mean, this does not help the United States at all to see all these countries destabilized. In addition, I also would say, though, unfortunately, it seems that the posturing of the current American elite, what they call the foreign policy elite, what they call the blob, is toward more confrontation with Russia. There was a horrible op-ed in Foreign Affairs by the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who was basically kind of proposing this idea that we need to build up, NATO forces in the Baltic states. We need to, enhance our presence in Ukraine. We need to enhance our presence in Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, Uzbekistan. We need to overthrow Lukashenko in Belarus. No matter what you think of Lukashenko, to overthrow him and kind of install a pro-Western government there, really, and to surround Russia, impose more sanctions on Russia. I can't see this being in any way helpful to American national security.
Well, even the terminology that they're using, right? The terminology that they use is containing Russia. It's like it's a virulent power that needs to be contained, which in the post-Soviet era is a failure by the West in bringing Russia into its fold.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's room for all. I think that when we talk about NATO, I think NATO is an obsolete organization. I think actually Gorbachev and Bush should have negotiated the creation of a pan-European security alliance that would have taken in, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and all the former Warsaw Pact states plus the post-Soviet space. I mean, and then there wouldn't be an issue like this. Everybody could kind of coexist and live together, and they would be fighting common security threats. Like let's say international terrorism or drug trafficking, real issues, instead of fighting among each other about, Abkhazia, let's say.
By the way, I was just reading that Philip T. Rieker, Assistant U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, is going to visit the region soon, and all the countries. So that'll be interesting to look out for. Going back to, I guess, just to close off this topic, it'd be interesting to see how the issue of these foreign-funded NGOs becomes a factor, if at all, in the recent elections. I believe that both the Parti Vunem Dashing or Alliance and also Robert Kocharan himself actually publicly expressed that there are some elements of civil society that are foreign funded, and they go against our not just national character but also our military sort of alliance, our they're not politicized essentially. So he wanted I believe he argued that something should be done about the ones that are foreign funded that are obviously politicized, but he also underscored that there's a segment of civil society that is not that is doing good, and that should not be touched. Anyway,
it's an interesting question. I think that it would be interesting to see what happens. I have nothing more really to say beyond that, but I think that it would be interesting to see how the issue is used during the elections by both sides.
Pietro, we're talking about the big bad West. Let's talk a little bit about China. Obviously, a rising economic superpower and 1.5 billion people. China is using its economic might to fund global-scale projects like its Belt and Road Initiative, which is connecting countries along the old Silk Road in ways that tie everyone into China's economic super engine, right? So, and it provides them carrots along the way. Some of this is coming very close to our home. China is ready and willing to invest something between $400 and $800 billion in Iran in the coming 25 years. So, I was wondering, from an Armenian perspective, where does China fit in our future plans?
I think China is a country that Armenia should engage with. I think that it is a country that, so now there's been recently some talk about China and Russia being, in Armenian circles anyway, in Armenian analytical circles, there is kind of this framing of Russia and China as being adversaries or competitors for influence in the post-Soviet space. In fact, they actually are
complementary.
Their relations are actually quite good, and they see their influence as complementary. So for Armenia, actually, it's good to have China in the picture, and also it helps in a way. In addition to China being friendly with Russia, it also helps diversify Armenia's foreign relations as well too. Actually, the former president understood this very well, Serge. To balance China, Russia, the West, all these countries, and to increase Armenia's independence in the process. That should be the ideal, not only Armenian but post-Soviet leader would strive for that in this geopolitical environment, to take the limited resources you have and maximize them, and maximize your independence in this very kind of straitjacketed framework. China has been expanding its influence in the region. Georgia is a very notable case.
Yeah.
I think I've discussed
and I was going to ask you about that too.
Yeah. Georgia is quite interesting because the current Georgian government, that is to say the Georgian Dream government, that is, kind of behind the scenes led by Bidzina Ivanishvili, that government has been very active in trying to enhance China's presence in the region, which is actually a very interesting element to watch from their perspective, because it shows that, unlike Saakashvili, who was willing to give all his chips in with the West, Ivanishvili was interested in diversifying Georgia's relations to enhance Georgia's independence. So you can actually say that in many ways Ivanishvili was more of a Georgian nationalist than Saakashvili, because he actually cared about Georgia's independence.
Well, I don't know. I never felt Saakashvili was a nationalist at all.
He enhanced, Ivanishvili that is, enhanced the relationship with China. Bashfield, he was prime minister of Georgia from 2013 and 2015, and now he's back to be the prime minister in 2021 again. In that interim period before, after his first stint as prime minister, and before coming back, he was actually on the board of a Chinese company, right? And he even wrote an article for the British press in favor of the Belt and Road Initiative. So it shows that China is increasing its presence in Georgia, and the Georgians are welcoming it because they want to offset the influence of the United States, which is very strong in the security sector, and it's very strong also in the energy sector, to the point that you even have cases where you have there was recently a U.S. company in Georgia, an energy company that was not paying Georgian workers, and the Georgian workers complained to the government, and the government tried to bring this issue to the United States, and in the end, no action really was taken on it. In fact, in our government here, in our Congress, there was significant, condemnation of the fact that why are the Georgians doing this? Why would they be upset that an American company isn't paying their workers? That sort of thing. It's like a story of it's like Batista's Cuba. I mean, and that's actually kind of the disturbing thing you're seeing here. So the Georgians understand this. They want to diversify their relations. They're doing it with China. Ivanishvili, to his credit, has really been trying to restore relations with Russia. He's been trying to reopen relations with Russia, which for Armenia is very beneficial. He supported reopening the Abkhaz Railway, which would be a huge boon for Armenia. He even talked in favor of, this idea of Georgia's Armenia way, that we should follow, Serge's complementary policy in Armenia. He was talking like this.
Pietro, is there any hope for that Abkhazian railway to come online?
Well, I don't know, because unfortunately, any talk of rapprochement with Russia is vilified in the Georgian political elite. It's become like a toxic issue, because Saakashvili, after the 2008 war, cut ties with Russia. And it's very hard to have a full-on restoration of even basic diplomatic ties. They don't even have the basic diplomatic ties. They have some trade going on. They have travel between the two countries. So that's been restored. But in terms of, they have Russian tourists coming to Georgia as well. But in terms of the restoration of diplomatic relations, it's still not there, and it's become like a toxic issue.
One of the ways that China's Belt and Road Initiative takes is that what we call is the North-South corridor that basically joins the Persian Gulf to the Black Sea. Can you talk a little bit about how that whole corridor is going to benefit us, and how we fit into China's plans?
Really quick, before I jump into that, I just want to go really back into Georgia. That a lot of that opposition, by the way, to restoration, even basic diplomatic ties with Russia, that a lot of it is coming from very, very pro-Western political forces in Georgia, who don't want any kind of restoration with ties with Russia. They also include pro-Western NGOs, or NGOs that are funded by the United States government. So that's another problem as well.
It's interesting to think about Georgia as a more radicalized split than Armenia.
Oh, well, I mean, there's division too. I mean, there's division in both these countries. And you can take it back centuries if you want to. But going back to your China question, so it was about the Persian Gulf and the Black Sea, North-South corridor.
Yes.
I think that the North-South corridor for China is incomplete without, first of all, it's incomplete without Iran. It's also incomplete without Russia. if you're going to have a north-south corridor, you're going to need both Russia and Iran.
Right.
And that's actually what the Georgians understood. The Georgians, going back to them, they were trying to even diversify their energy supply with both, Russia and Iran. And actually, the United States, kind of put a wet blanket on that. So that's another thing as well too. I think that north, south, even east, west, these corridors can be very useful, but particularly for Armenia, north, south, especially in the current conditions.
Yeah.
So I think that anything that if China is coming in and they're offering investment into Armenia, sure. I mean, I think that Armenia can work with the Chinese, and I think that Georgia can too, and I think that Russia can, and Iran. I think that all these countries can work together.
Yeah.
To enhance connections and communications. Why not? Yeah, what's the downside of that?
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that part of it is also when we look at it from the perspective of the American War Party, they're like, well, this would, challenge American, dominance as the sole superpower in the world.
Well, the whole American view is somewhat adversarial. If it was a little more cooperative, collaborative, I think it would be all better.
Yeah, and I also think, Asbed, going back to, during the 2000s, so I was witness to, the news during this period of the Iraq War. And, people in the media would criticize Bush's cowboy diplomacy.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this cowboy diplomacy of Bush now, I mean, it's spread to both parties. Both parties, have taken this like gospel that we are the number one country in the world. We are the superpower. Mm-hmm. We should be the only superpower. And nobody should challenge us. That sort of a thing, and that we should dictate to other countries which leadership they have. I was watching a news report tonight. I was flipping through the channels, and it was about Venezuela, and the way the American media was talking about Venezuela, it was as if they were bad. The Venezuelans were bad for keeping Maduro in. That somehow having Maduro there was against American interests. Mm-hmm. That these people had to remove that leader because we didn't like him. Well, who are the Americans to say? Even if you don't agree with the Venezuelan government's, domestic policy, why is it the concern of the United States, their domestic policy?
Yeah, there's a sense of entitlement in meddling in other countries' affairs.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's extended unfortunately, to the post-Soviet space.
Pietro, let me go back to our sphere. How does Armenia's patron saint, Russia, plan to compete in a world where the economic superpowers are 10 times its population size? What does the future hold for Russia? I mean, we're talking about a country with 150 million people against a country like India and China both have 1.5 billion each. Where does it go?
Well, population numbers aren't everything. That's number one. I've closely examined the demographics of Russia. And Russia's demographics really kind of bottomed out in the 1990s. Putin, to his credit, made efforts to raise the birth rate in Russia. And there was a great analyst of Russian affairs who was writing for Forbes magazine, Mark Adamanis, who actually was, very closely chronicling, the effort by the Russian government, by Moscow, to improve its demographics. Okay. And actually, it was quite remarkable. They managed to raise the birth rate in Russia. The alcohol consumption has gone down, especially of hard alcohol, and actually beer.
Has the life expectancy gone up?
Yeah, actually it has gone up. And so slowly but surely things were improving. But now you have this, first of all, the Western sanctions. You have economic challenges. And you also have, on top of that, the rising, I think this kind of was rolled into the economic challenges, but the inequality, is a major issue. Putin actually managed to kind of improve the economy and to help develop a middle class in Russia. This is a major problem. So I was in Russia, and I had talked to a lot of people on the streets about what are the conditions in Russia, and people were most worried about the economy. And actually, there was a lot of criticism of Putin about the economy. And again, it goes back to this issue of the inequality, that people want to have economic improvements, more opportunities. This is actually going to be Russia's major challenge. Demographics, by the way, the birth rate has gone down again, but this is not necessarily because of people having fewer kids. It's because of the fact that so few people, Asbed, were born in the 1990s. The 1990s really was, like I said,
A free fall,
Yeah,
basically.
free fall, and so few people were born that naturally is going to level. It's naturally going to, cut into the demographics
But
of Russia.
Pietro,
No.
I think those troughs and everything notwithstanding, we're talking about 150 million people today and 1.5 billion people in China. I mean, even America.
I want to also say this too, though.
Yeah.
I wanted to finish up what I was going to say. That
Sure.
I think that China, yeah, I mean, definitely. So there's that, and I think that Russia, unlike China, has major economic problems. You can't compare Russia's economy with China's economy. Certainly not. And same thing with the population.
Why can't we compare it? At the end of the day, it's just a GDP number, right?
Yeah, I mean, by what I'm saying is that the Chinese economy is like a roaring tiger.
Right.
I mean, it's absolutely incredible, and I think that they're actually it's a huge success. I mean, think about where the Chinese were in 1949 versus today.
Right. The demographics are very important because they have
But
a
they
lot
have
of cheap
but this is
labor.
Asbed. This is where I want to actually cut in. That they actually now their demographics are kind of slowing down. So you might have heard this week in the news that now China has pushed forth this three-child policy.
Yes.
Because because the birth rate used to be very high in China, and they put the one-child policy, and over time people began to have fewer kids. And now you see the impact of this, that now people have to be encouraged by Beijing to have kids. And they tried to do a two-child policy. That didn't work. Now they're trying to do a three-child policy.
They've had half a century of the one-child policy.
Yeah. And then also when we go looking at a case like India, India is completely different because even though the population, yes, it's a huge population in India, but they also have major problems. I mean, you think Russia, they have inequality. India, they have the caste system. The infrastructure there is not as advanced as in other places. I mean, there are so many problems.
America right now has 330 million people, and they're considering ways of increasing the American population to 1 billion, right? What kind of policies do we need to implement to go to 1 billion? Because they feel essentially they're not going to be able to compete as a world superpower if they don't have the economy to compete with China. And eventually India will come along also, maybe in 50 years, but America will become a second-rate country. So that was my initial question. Maybe I didn't put it correctly, that Russia at 150 million and a very slow ramp back, at most it has all these resources. It's a huge country, but what kind of economy is it going to be able to run to compete at least the Russian mentality is that they are a superpower, right? So how are they going to compete and remain relevant on the world stage?
Well, I mean, right off the bat, they have geography, and they also have tons of natural resources, and it depends on how they use that in the future. I mean, even with the population that they have, I mean, they still are a force to be reckoned with in the world.
Today, they still are, yes, thanks to the remnants of their Soviet nuclear arsenal.
I just want to add one more thing. That this issue of the demographics is also another of China's demographics slowing down. It's also a story that also extends to the Muslim world, by the way, because Iran's demographics are slowing down. Turkey's demographics, at least among the Turkish population, is slowing down. Among Kurds, it's up. As far as I know, I haven't checked in lately with that, but that's another story too, that in the Muslim world, birth rates are slowing down as well too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, demographics, it's a tough... It's not something you can readily pinpoint at as like an indicator necessarily of a superpower, and also it depends how they evolve. I mean, we have to watch in the very, very long term, like over the course of like 50 years, how they evolve and what impact that's going to have on the economy, on the society.
Well, from Armenia's perspective, as I said initially, Russia is our patron saint. They're the ones who are protecting us right now. And if they're not going to be able to do it 50 years from now, how are we going to survive in a very, very rough neighborhood?
And that's why, going back to what I said, you need almost an iron ladle idea that, Armenia has to think, at some point, if if God forbid Russia isn't here, what do? We have to think of even the worst case scenario, right? So that's what when we think about independence. I mean, Armenia at some point has to think, well, what happens if Russia, is out of the picture? If there's like another, smuta, if there's another kind of time of troubles, or, some kind of catastrophe there, what happens to Armenia?
Yeah.
And Armenia should be very concerned when there are discussions among some Russian analysts that they say, well, maybe it's too much that we even are in the post-Soviet space, right? There's like a fringe of Russian analysts who talk like this. But for Russia, the post-Soviet countries are intimately linked with their security. And that's going to be something that's never going to change in the foreseeable future.
Hovik, do you have any thoughts on this discussion?
I think that it would be interesting to see what Armenia is doing or can do to influence political opinion. I think that a lot of it is influenced by currently, I think there's a lot of money, Azerbaijani money going into Russian think tanks, Russian influencers. So I think one solution to that is to have a more active foreign policy and cooperate with Russian think tanks more and get this message across and help Russians help Russia or some Russian analysts understand why this is not a good idea to pull out.
Well, also one thing I want to say, Hovik, you're spot on. And when I was in Moscow, I was working in the Russian archives, in the Russian State Archive for Social Political History. They have a bookstore. And I was shocked to find Russian translations of Justin McCarthy's denialist tracts about the Armenian genocide, or Azerbaijani, propaganda about, I don't know, Armenian terrorism, in Russian translation that was being sold there at the Russian State Archive. That means that somehow these books, through Turkish diplomatic influence, these such works were getting filtered in there. Where was the Armenian response? First of all, where was the Armenian community? I talked to the Armenian community in Moscow. I talked to representatives. And they said, well, we're trying to get community leaders to do something about it, but they don't see the value in such a project as this. And the same thing, where was Armenia itself?
It's not just the community. That's something that billionaires like Ruben Vartanyan can do. And frankly, I'm seeing a lot of, they're doing something, so that's good. I frankly will not comment on the future Armenia initiative because I see some problems with it. But at least, in Russia, just, found some think tanks. No matter what future Armenia as a project does, if Russia decides to withdraw from Armenia, then that's a huge problem. So found a couple of think tanks that could sort of help influence this opinion, help narrow the gap a little bit in terms of lopsided thinking.
Yeah, and if Russia is gone from the Caucasus, imagine, Turkey, like I said, is going to fill the void, and NATO will fill the void, and Russia will have a major security problem on its southern borders. A major security problem. So, that's why, Armenians have to make it clear to Moscow. This is a very serious issue at stake.
Yeah, and I think Russia's successes in sort of taming, if I can use that word, or reducing the terrorist threat in Chechnya and Dagestan, and thanks to Putin, have maybe gotten them a little bit too relaxed about the issue. It just takes a couple of years and to foster irredentist sentiments there.
And also think about I just want to say one more thing really quick on this issue is that imagine Turkish influence in the region versus Russian influence. Well, the Russians encouraged kind of the multi-ethnic character of the Caucasus. They encouraged all these patchworks of people to more or less kind of coexist. Whereas, look at Turkey. Turkey, look at what they did with the Armenians. Look at what they did with the Greeks. Look at what they're doing with the Kurds.
Exactly.
Take your options.
Yeah, totally going for the mono-ethnic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, also look at the bigger geopolitical picture again. If we back up, who benefits from Russia leaving the post-Soviet space? Because at the end of the day, let's say, who benefits if you lose the war in Artsakh, and you end up giving Artsakh more or less to Azerbaijan? If Pashinyan had continued the war, that's what would have happened if the Russians hadn't intervened. There would have been no Karabakh left. And so, who benefits from that picture where Armenia is not relying on the Russian security architecture? The Artsakh is gone, Karabakh is gone. And Armenia, it would float toward the west at that point. Who benefits from that? And the answer is the American military-industrial complex.
Turkey.
Right.
So, Pietro, does Armenia have a bright future? What do you see happening moving forward?
Well, I remain an optimist. I hope and I believe Armenia will come out of this. I don't think Pashinyan is forever. And I think that Armenia can assert itself and find a new path on its own. I don't think that I don't think that Pashinyan is its fate. I think that it will overcome this.
Mm-hmm.
So that being said, to kind of summarize, I'm an optimist. I think that I think things will eventually change in Armenia and Artsakh, and we should be hopeful and we should retain that hope. Because hope dies last.
So I'll have to put you in the column for yes, but there are tough times ahead.
Yes, I would say yes, but there are tough times ahead, and that's without a doubt. But we shouldn't give up hope.
Hovik?
Of course, if Armenians want to have a future, then Armenia should have a bright future.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, and I would agree. A bright future is in Armenia's cards if the Armenians make it so.
All right. Thank you. We'll stop right there. Pietro, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a fun conversation here.
It has been. I enjoyed it immensely, and thank you for this opportunity. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
That concludes this Conversations on Grung episode. We hope it was helpful in your understanding of some of the issues involved. We look forward to your feedback, including your suggestions for conversation topics in the future. Contact us on our website at grung.org or on our Facebook page, ANN-Grung, or in our Facebook group, Grung-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, like our pages, and follow us on social media. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.